Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We've got, I think, one of my favorite topics today, and that is fertility and reproduction that we're going to be hitting you with this afternoon. And joining us for that discussion is Dr. Paul Fricke, who is a dairy reproduction specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So might be a familiar face and/or name to many of you out there, as this is definitely going to be a fun discussion here this afternoon. And with it being a discussion, that means we want you to
Mhm.
interact with us if you have the chance. I know a lot of you are potentially out there in the fields doing some hay, so make sure to be careful. But when we're having this discussion, you can join in by having your questions be asked to our expert here this afternoon. All you have to do is head over to the bottom right-hand portion of your screen where you're going to see three little dots. And on those dots, you click it, and there it asks or prompts you to ask a question. It does ask for your name and information. If you don't want to give that, feel free to leave it blank, put NA, whatever else in between. But we would love for you to join in on this discussion here today if you have the chance. But with all of that being said, we've got a lot of information to dive into here this afternoon. And without further ado, I'm going to say hello, Paul. How are you doing here this afternoon? And thank you for joining us again today.
Amber, I'm doing wonderful, and I just want to thank you so much for the invitation. I love doing these podcasts. I think you got a great audience, and so I'm looking forward to covering this information.
Well, we're excited to have you back. Like I said, this is one of my favorite areas where I get to geek and nerd out a little bit. So, this is right up my alley, and I'm excited to dive into it here today with you. But I know you've got some slides and some really great information to get into. So, I'm actually going to pass it right back off to you to get us started here.
Okay, Amber, I'm going to jump right in. I've got plenty of information to cover, and the title of my talk today is The Evolution of Fertility Programs for Lactating Dairy Cows. And so I want to kind of tell a story, and the story is going to start here. We're going to talk about how we measure dairy herd fertility. We should think about this. And I like to say that reproductive performance in a dairy herd is determined by how rapidly the reproductive management program turns open cows into pregnant cows. And there's many different metrics for reproduction, but the one that we've been using for a long time now is called the 21-day pregnancy rate. Like everyone is familiar with that. I think that's the language that we talk with when we're talking about repro. But the important thing about that 21-day pregnancy rate, it's determined by an interaction between the service rate, or the rate at which we can breed cows, and then of the cows that we breed, how well they get pregnant. We usually call that a conception rate. I'm going to use the term pregnancies per AI. And just going back in time, if I could just put everyone into a time machine and take them back, to 1995, so a long time ago, kind of when I first came to UW-Madison, repro was not good in our lactating dairy cows. And this is something I struggle with on campus with the students that I have nowadays. They grew up in this era of really high preg rates, just normal. It was just it's normal to have 25, 30, 35, even 40% preg rates nowadays. That wasn't true when I first came to Wisconsin. Average preg rates were in the 14% range. And it's because we didn't have very good plans for reproduction. We couldn't put semen into cows very well. Heat detection was very limiting. And of the lactating cows that we inseminated, conception rates were quite low. Okay. So that's just kind of the way that it was. And I'm going to start here with talking about protocols. This is the first publication on OffSync. So I came to Wisconsin in October of 1995 to do a postdoc with Milo Wiltbank. And Richard Pursley, who's now at Michigan State University, and Milo developed this protocol. So I think everyone knows that. This is a Wisconsin thing, right? This came from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Reproductive physiologists had been working for a way to do timed inseminations in lactating dairy cows without the need for estrus detection, because that's the big rate limiting step. And they've been trying to figure this out for like 30 years. And these guys figured it out. And so the protocol is up here on the screen. GnRH, 7 days later, prostaglandin. The original protocol was 48 hours later, GnRH, and then 16 hours later, timed insemination. And Amber, I just was trying to think of a way I can't, underemphasize how important of a paper this was and how big of a shift this was. So what I did is I found this paper. This is a paper in Human Reproduction. This was published in 2009, so it's relatively old. So this is Human Reproduction, 100 papers to read before you die. That's the name of this thing. And basically, they're just looking at highly cited papers. And right there, number 7 on this list in human reproduction is the paper by Pursley and Wiltbank, Synchronization of Ovulation in Dairy Cows Using PGF2 Alpha and GnRH. At this time, there were 377 references. As of May 2026, I just looked this up, the original ObSync paper has been cited 2,380 times in scientific papers. It's just incredible how much this changed things. And I'm going to talk first about ObSync. We talked about the 21-day pregnancy rate. The early studies with ObSync, and what I'm showing here is a table that's got some data. So I've got 2 different papers. What they did is they compared conception rates to cows that were inseminated to estrus versus timed AI after an ObSync program. And the take-home message here is that ObSync is not a fertility program. ObSync is simply a way to increase the service rate. You can put more semen into cows over time, and that really drives the 21-day pregnancy rate. But the emphasis here is that the ObSync protocol alone is not a fertility program. It is just a service rate type of a program. Okay, so Amber, when I go to a dairy and they want me to look at their reproductive management program, we were talking right before this started, you got to have a plan. You got to have a plan. Okay, that's the big thing. And another thing I want to emphasize, I'm not here to tell everybody what plan is the best. I'm going to offer some different plans, and I've seen different things work on dairies. But if you don't have a plan, then you plan to fail, right? And so I'm going to ask 2 questions if I came to your farm. The first question is, what's your plan for first insemination? Do you have a strategy to put semen into cows for the first time? And we have programs and technologies that we can just increase the service rate. That's like ObSync. But we now have fertility programs, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Once you get a first insemination plan in place, nowadays we can get about half our cows pregnant to first insemination. So half of them still, we need to diagnose them non-pregnant, and then couple that with a really good strategy to get semen into cows a second time. This is the resync discussion. And so I'm going to talk about plans for first insemination, and then we'll go through some plans for non-pregnancy diagnosis and re-insemination. So Amber, when you asked me to do this talk, I was very excited. I had been doing this topic like forever. So I looked up, this is back in 2002. So shortly after I was an assistant professor back then. And that's a picture of me. If you're riding in a tractor now, you can't see, but I don't look anything like this anymore. I was a young guy at that particular time. But the talk I was given at that time was ObSync, Presync, Resync, the kitchen sink. I mean, after ObSync was developed, there was all these variations. It was like going to Baskin Robbins. You got 57 different flavors. And everything was just completely chaotic. And people would say, well, I don't even know what protocol I should be using. I told people at this time that would settle down, that we'd kind of coalesce around some major strategies. And that's exactly what happened. And so what I'm showing on the screen now is just a plot from a herd management software of days to first insemination. And all this graph shows is that the first way people used ObSync was as a backup. So you'll never catch all of your cows in heat. People were doing estrus detection. And in this case, the voluntary waiting period was 45 days. They bred about 70, maybe 80% of their cows from 45 to 70 days in milk. And then you've got a bunch of cows that you just can't see in heat. So what they would do at day 70 is they just program them into an ObSync program. And now we've got a strategy to deal with all cows. At least we're getting semen into all cows, because Amber, the key to reproduction is, in order to get a cow pregnant, the first thing you have to do is put semen into that cow. If you don't take step number 1, she's never going to be pregnant. So we could deal with those non-cycling cows, or cows we can't see in estrus, with an ObSync protocol. But what we've learned in the meantime, and these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different studies that looked at, they put cows on an ObSync program, and they separated them into whether they were cycling, we call those ovular cows, or non-cycling cows, anovular cows. And what we know is that about 20 to 30% of our dairy cows are not cycling at about 60 to 70 days in milk. Okay. If you put a cycling or an ovular cow in ObSync, they got 38% conception rates. If they put a non-cycling or an anovular cow onto an off-sync program, the conception rate wasn't zero, but it was lower. It was 25%. So people using off-sync in this way, Amber, the early discussions that I was having with farmers is they weren't happy with the low conception rates to off-sync, but it was because of the way they were using it. They were using on this class of cows we call anovular, gave us a way to get those cows pregnant. But fertility in both cases, 38% and 25%, Amber, I would say now we're looking for 50% conception rates in our lactating dairy cows. And these are low numbers. Again, OVSync is not a fertility program. Okay, so now I'm going to switch. So I talked a little bit about OVSync in the early days. Now I'm going to talk about this concept of development of fertility programs. OVSync can increase the service rate. It really didn't increase pregnancies for AI, but the quest was on how do we improve fertility to these programs. And I'll go back. I remember when I was in Milo's lab as a postdoc, we'd put these two pictures up on the screen. So I got a picture of a lactating dairy cow and a picture of a non-lactating heifer. And at this time, heifers were very fertile. And so I just put some repro characteristics here. Heifers and cows are very different. So cows show estrus better than heifers. They have higher estradiol at estrus. Heifers have more peak progesterone at estrus. Heifers have greater conception rates than lactating dairy cows. They have much lower incidences of pregnancy loss, and they have much lower incidences of multiple ovulations and twinning. And so at this time, I remember Milo would always ask the question, what is the physiologic factor that can explain this difference? Why are heifers very fertile and cows are not? And obviously the difference here is milk production. And so Milo in 2002 published this paper, again, a very, very important paper, a big paradigm shift in our understanding. And what this has to do is feed intake. So high milk production is driven by high feed intake. And every farmer knows this. Your highest producing cows are the ones that eat the best. You cannot have a high producing cow that doesn't eat a lot, right? Those two things go hand in hand. And there's a physiology around feed intake where they have high feed intake and they divert blood flow to the gut or the viscera because of that high feed intake, right? It's why we get tired after we eat lunch or after we eat a big Thanksgiving meal. You're going to sit down and watch the Lions get beat by someone on television, right? And so that's going to make you tired, all that feed intake. And so what happens is the blood that leaves the gut travels through the hepatic portal circulation and goes directly to the liver. And the liver is extremely efficient at conjugating, we say metabolizing ovarian steroids. And so we end up with a high producing dairy cow with decreased circulating levels of estradiol and progesterone. So we call this idea here kind of a physiologic model. And we can test that model. And that's what we've done over the past 20 years. So if the case, we can ask questions like this. If the problem is low progesterone, what would happen if we got progesterone up where it needed to be in a high producing dairy cow? And there's ways that we can do that. Okay, we can manipulate our physiology so that we can do that. Maybe we could decrease twinning rates. Maybe we could increase conception rates. Maybe we could decrease pregnancy loss rates. We can reverse some of these problems in lactating dairy cows. And in fact, this is the idea that really drove the development of fertility programs. And I just threw this in there. I know not everyone is watching a screen. You might be driving a tractor right now, but what I'm showing on the screen is the normal physiology around the time of ovulation. And it's just that after, if a heifer doesn't get pregnant, the CL regresses, progesterone goes down, estradiol comes up, this follicle's growing, she'll come into estrus, there'll be an LH surge, she'll ovulate about a 15 millimeter follicle. And what we think this liver metabolism does to these cows is it alters this sequence of events. So in a high producing dairy cow with all this liver metabolism, she'll regress her corpus luteum and estradiol will begin to increase. These LH pulses start to increase that drive this follicular growth. But because the liver is metabolizing that estrogen, follicles have to grow larger and longer in cows. And that's not good for fertility because they're overexposed to these LH pulses. So you get overexposure of the oocyte to LH. We get premature oocyte maturation, ovulation of what we call an aged oocyte. We can increase double ovulations and twinning in this scenario, which I'll come back to later. And we ovulate a much larger follicle. Okay. So it's kind of, and we've taken The average cycle length of a heifer is about 21 days. Lactating dairy cows, it's about 23. And so we've increased this interval from luteal regression to ovulation. This is what we think is the problem in our cows that are coming into estrus, but we can correct this problem with the fertility program. All right, Amber, that's the physiology I wanted to cover. So we got through that. All right, so I'm going to start. I'm going to cover two fertility programs, and the one on the screen now is one that's been around for a long time. It's called a pre-sync OVSync program, and this is still widely used. It's still a good plan for first insemination. And what it is an OVSync protocol, but before you do that, you give a couple of treatments of prostaglandin 14 days apart, and then 10 to 12 days later, you start an OVSync protocol. And I'll show you the idea behind this in just a few minutes. There's some misconceptions about this protocol that I want to talk about. And the first one, this idea that these prostaglandin treatments clean the uterus. A lot of people still talk about that. That's often why we give prostaglandins, but the data on doing that is not very good, okay, especially with endometritis and that kind of a thing. And then the other idea is that we're going to breed cows after that second prostaglandin. So first thing I'll tackle, nice study here from Florida, Jose Santos' lab. I haven't talked about double OVSync yet, but they had 3 groups of cows. They had no prostaglandins before starting a double OVSync, a single prostaglandin before starting a double OVSync, and 2 prostaglandins 14 days apart before starting a double OVSync. And the hypothesis was those prostaglandins will increase fertility. And in the end, there was no difference in fertility. Okay. So I don't know. I think not many people are doing this anymore, but people used to give even a third prostaglandin early postpartum to all cows. I kind of told people it doesn't look like that's working, so we can just take that out of there. Just the 2 is all that you need. This graph goes back a long time. This is one of the early OVSync studies, and the question they were asking was, does stage of the cycle matter when you start the protocol? And it ends up that yes, it does. And this data showed that anywhere from day 5 to day 12 would be a better time to start an OVSync program than early, day 1 to 4, or late in the cycle, 13 to 21. We've narrowed this down a little bit more to say like day 6 or 7. But that's the data that then caused these guys to say, if we could pre-synchronize the cows, then we can get them in this better stage of the cycle, and then we can improve fertility. And so here's just another scatter plot. I'm showing typically what people do, and there's different variations on this as well that we can talk about if you want. A lot of people give that first prostaglandin on, say, around day 36 post-calving. They won't breed to that one. 14 days later, around day 50, they'll give the second one. That's their voluntary waiting period. Then they'll watch cows in heat and breed the cows that they see, and then the cows that they don't see finish the OVSync protocol. And what we have here, Amber, is just what we're doing is we're getting more control over when we put semen into cows for the first time. Just we're reducing the variation in days in milk at first insemination. Okay. This is an interesting study Richard Pursley over at Michigan State did. What they did, and the question, Amber, that I'm going to try to answer, a lot of people ask, should we cherry pick or not? You know, you were talking about these heat detection systems. A lot of people have these activity monitoring systems. I think that's great technology. My question is, how do we put those technologies together with, say, timed insemination? So what Pursley did is he had 2 different groups of cows. They both went through a pre-sync OVSync. Half the cows, 100% timed AI, so no cherry picking, versus the other group in which they bred 36% of the cows to the first prostaglandin, 42% to the second prostaglandin, and only 22% get to timed AI. Okay, so the top protocol, 100% timed AI. Bottom protocol is kind of, let's do as much estrus detection as possible and minimize the cows getting to timed AI and OVSync. And what they showed in this high-producing herd in Michigan is that when you do that cherry picking, you decrease conception rate to first service. And it was big in this study. It was 31% for the estrus followed by timed AI, and it was 45% for 100% timed AI to first breeding. So that's a 45% increase in pregnant cows, which is a lot. And one thing I will say, I'm not against cherry picking. But the more cows we can get pregnant at first service, the fewer cows we have to mess with later. And the other thing we can do with these programs is we can combine them with other technologies like sex semen. And in that case, I want as high of a conception rate as I can get to first insemination. Okay, I'm just showing this held up within a parity, first, second, and third plus lactation cows. There was always an increase in fertility. So we can get, I guess what I would say, Amber, is we can get better fertility to first service by doing a fertility program, okay, than doing a lot of heat detection at that time. So I'm back to my table now. We showed OVSync. It's not a fertility program. Pre-sync OVSync that's 100% time to AI is a fertility program. So conception rates to estrus were rather low in these couple of studies, in the low 30s. We can get into the low 40s or mid 40s with the pre-sync OVSync program. All right, we're going to get to the third kind of major way that people. So we kind of looked at OVSync alone, watching for heat, backup with OVSync. We talked about a pre-sync OVSync with and without cherry picking. This protocol, many people will be familiar with. It's a double OVSync protocol, first published in 2008. Again, this is University of Wisconsin data out of Milo Wiltbank's lab. And what they did is rather than using two prostaglandins to pre-synchronize the cows, they used the full OVSync. And I'm showing that in red on this screen here. And that first OVSync does a couple things. Number one, if cows are not cycling, those 20 to 30% are not cycling, combining GnRH and prostaglandin will get some of those cows cycling. A lot of them, 80% of them. And then the second thing it does is that if they synchronize to that last GnRH of the first OVSync, they're exactly day 7 of the cycle when they start the second OVSync. Now, this is where science gets interesting. This protocol did those two things, but it created a new problem. Okay, and here's something that I'll say: fertility factors that limit fertility to an estrus are very different than factors that limit fertility to these protocols. So the factors that limit fertility to estrus is the graph I showed you with the follicles growing and the extension of the cycle and the LH pulses and all that kind of stuff. These protocols, what it comes down to is giving the right treatments to the right cows on the right days and getting them to respond the way that we want them to. So it's about synchrony to the protocol, really. First study with they compared pre-sync OVSync 100% time to AI to double OVSync. The graph I'm showing here, there is an improvement in fertility with double OVSync over pre-sync OVSync. It isn't huge because pre-sync OVSync 100% time to AI is a fertility program. At this time, I'm showing you the problem that it created. And what it is with the younger cows, the first lactation cows have very high fertility, okay? 50%, 48% to 53%. It's the older cows that we couldn't get to budge on fertility. And so the question that was asked is, maybe those older cows aren't synchronizing properly. And it ends up that was the key, because what we were looking for at this time was, what is the rate limiting step to fertility in these programs? Is it ovulation of the first GnRH treatment of the OVSync protocol? Is it ovulation to the last GnRH program? Or is it maybe luteal regression? And it ends up it was luteal regression. And when we force cows to start OVSync on day 7 and we give GnRH, we're trying to regress a young CL that's only 7 days old at that prostaglandin. And what was happening is those older cows, because they acquired luteolytic capacity a little later, were failing to regress. And I'm going to show a graph. We had over 3,000 cows. We took blood sample at that last GnRH treatment, which is what I'm showing. And what this graph shows is that cows that had low progesterone, 0.4 nanograms per mil or lower at the last GnRH, had pretty decent fertility. But there's a group of about 14% of the cows that were not fully regressing their CL. And that progesterone hangs around for a little too long at a higher level. What we think that does is it probably inhibits sperm transport. Okay, so this was the problem. You're looking right there at the physiologic nature of this particular problem. How do we fix that? Well, this is when the second prostaglandin that was given 24 hours after the first one of these protocols was added. Okay, so you're familiar with that, Amber. A lot of people have seen this. So um, a second prostaglandin was added 24 hours after the first. And I'll tell you, Amber, when that was done, I've never made many recommendations where you just say, okay, add this treatment. And people just came back and said, wow, that was amazing. Because that was the rate limiting step. Once we got those CL to regress, now we have a fertility program. And this is kind of the one of the preferred fertility programs out there is double off sync. And
Well, and
yeah,
before
go
you move
ahead.
on from that, I just
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
say, when looking at that and hearing your explanation, that makes so much sense. Maybe this is a little bit too much of me to say, but I was just like, that's the protocol, that's what you do. But explaining it as to why that second
Yep,
one came about
exactly.
makes so much sense. So sorry, I'm just a little bit
Yeah,
mind
no,
blown
that's
over here
great.
as to
Thanks for the
why that
comment.
is.
That means maybe I'm explaining it okay. I don't know. So, that's why I call this the evolution of fertility programs because it was a stepwise process. It was, this protocol didn't come out of thin air. And the other thing that I would mention, Amber, is a lot of people look at these protocols and say, how do you guys just throw a dart at the board and say, let's put a GnRH there and a prostaglandin there and a GnRH there? And it didn't work like that. There was a lot of thought behind this particular protocol, stepwise things that happened that we learned along the way and kind of developed this thing. And so it was really fun to kind of be somewhat involved with that. We did a study then. A lot of people wanted to know how much better is double off sync than breeding to estrus. So what I'm showing here is a study we did back in 2017. We randomized half of the herd to get a double off sync with the second prostaglandin and timed AI versus a protocol that we use to bring the cows into estrus at the same day in milk. And so we could compare at the same day in milk range fertility to estrus versus timed AI after a fertility program, and it was 10 percentage points. So it was 39% for the estrus cows. It was 49% for the double off sync cows. And remember, I told you, 25 years ago, average conception rates in lactating dairy cows were in the 30% range. Now our expectation is to be closer to 50%, and we're getting there with this protocol. Now, the other thing that you have to keep in mind, this is only half of that pregnancy rate equation. With a timed AI program, you breed 100% of the cows for first breeding. So you're getting half of all cows pregnant in the double off sync program. You're getting 39% of the 78% that you can catch in estrus in the lower protocol. So when I calculate the proportion of pregnant cows at 110 days in milk, it was 49% for double off sync and timed AI versus 30% for the other protocol. So that's kind of where we are here. I'm just showing you a scatter plot, days in milk at first insemination with 100% timed AI for first AI. Amber, if I would have told people 25 years ago that we would have voluntary waiting periods of 70 to 80 days, they wouldn't have understood what I was talking about. We had voluntary waiting periods of 45 to 60 days. Okay. But when we can get half of our cows pregnant at first insemination and we can control when we put semen into cows, this is kind of what I've seen people do. And we could have there's a lot to talk about with voluntary waiting periods. I think it depends on the protocol that you're running. But certainly, if I'm running a fertility program and I'm getting in that 50% conception rate to first service, I don't want my cows pregnant at 60 days. I would rather have them pregnant a little bit later. So, but not too late. So we don't want to do that yet. So that's kind of an interesting story. So I put together this table now so we can see the fertility program double off sync. So pre-sync off sync 100% timed AI, double off sync 100% timed AI. Those are fertility programs. And I guess, Amber, we were talking about use of the heat detection systems again. A lot of people tried to pull like a double off sync or, out of the first breeding and just breed to estrus. And what they found is that you drop back in conception rate. So a lot of our herds in this part of the country that I'm in here, the upper Midwest, the Northeast, that kind of area, we don't have very good heat detection rates. We have fairly high producing dairy cows. And a lot of herds are kind of going for that first insemination off of a fertility program. You can do a lot of things. You can control your voluntary waiting period. You can combine it with other technologies like sex semen. you can get half your cows pregnant at first insemination. And again, I'm not saying you have to do that. But that's what a lot of herds are doing. Couple little random things I want to talk about before I get into the resync part of the story. Nice study that was done by my former student Julio Giordano in New York. The question is, we have ways to select for fertility now with genomics. We can select for daughter pregnancy rate. And the question was, as we select genetically for higher fertility, maybe we won't need a double offsync protocol. And so what they did is they went to, I think, 5 different herds in New York. They took first lactation cows, they genomically tested them, and they categorized them as low, medium, and high fertility. And within each of those groups, they randomized the cows to either get bred to an estrus, cleaned up with an off-sync, kind of the first protocol I talked about, versus a double off-sync protocol. And what I'm showing here is that conception rate increases with these different fertility classes. So genetics is real. We can predict that, right? So we're 43% for the low fertility cows, 48% for medium, 55% for high fertility. Let's see what happens with double off-sync. It was about 10 percentage points greater in each of those groups. And it doesn't appear that it's diminishing in the high fertility cows. So we call this kind of an additive effect. It's independent and it's additive. So we can select for genetics for good fertility, but the thing that double off-sync is doing is working in addition to that. So it doesn't appear that even in those high fertility cows, Amber, we're still seeing a big difference in fertility. So I think that's interesting, just something to think about. The other concept that I've been talking a lot about, and I think I've done this on one of your podcasts before, this concept of the high fertility cycle. Percy and I were talking a lot. I'm showing this 10 percentage point increase in fertility due to these fertility programs. That 10% increase in fertility did not account for the dramatic rise in pregnancy rates we got. So it explains some of it, right? But this other concept comes in, and it's just a concept that if we can get our cows pregnant in a timely manner at the end of the voluntary waiting period, they don't have extended lactations where they get fat late in lactation. Calve is fat cows, and then they're kind of having a metabolic train wreck when they come into milk. And so we start. I think timed AI programs have played a big role in getting herds into the high fertility cycle. And I think, like I said, Amber, if people want to go back and review kind of the talks that I've done on that, they're free to do that. And then the other thing, and I think I did this topic as well. People ask me all the time about timing of insemination. I'm going to summarize this. Basically, the last generation of an off-sync program is physiologically about the same as the onset of estrus activity. So if you have an activity monitoring system, those 2 things are about the same. We know that cows are going to ovulate about 28 hours after those 2 events. So if we know when they're going to ovulate, we know when to put semen into them. Based on the studies in that paper, optimal timing of AI occurs 13 to 23 hours after G2 or the onset of estrus activity. Okay, so 13 to 23 hours is a big window. So that's good for farmers, right? You got lots of time. Sperm viability and oocyte viability limit fertility. So if you breed too early, you get decreased fertility due to aged sperm. If you breed too late, you get decreased fertility to an aged oocyte. So good news, we've got more time. You don't have to be exactly 16 hours from the last generation to breeding. So, and again, I think I talked about this on another podcast. Another thing that I just want to bring up, people are getting creative with adopting technologies. This is a picture I'm showing of a pneumatic system for administering these treatments. And so you can see the device that the person is holding in their hand just has a nub at the end of it. You can just press that up against the hide of the cow, and it just shoots it right through the skin into the muscle. So we can give GnRH or prostaglandin this way. No needles. This particular farm was they wanted to limit leukosis, which is spread by blood. So you don't want to use a needle, or you'd have to use a fresh needle in each cow. But I'm just showing a picture of a rotary. They built a platform. And so the 2 workers are looking at the parlor boss system, which each cow in their stall And that way you see where the cow is and you can give the right stuff to the right cow. And, the cow that's in the wrong pen has to get milk, so she gets what she needs. And so this really improves compliance. And just uh, just to say, Amber, that I think the first big challenge we had with these programs was just getting compliance to the programs, getting the right stuff to the right cow on the right day. And in a large farm, that's a challenge. And these new systems, we can do that very easily. Okay, so I think I'm on schedule here. So we're going to talk about re-insemination. So we talked about first insemination. We talked about 3 plans. Now with re-insemination, it gets more complicated because we have cows that were previously inseminated. So you have to know if they're pregnant or not before you can resynchronize it. So the key to an early pregnancy diagnosis is to couple identification of non-pregnant cows with a strategy to rapidly return them to an AI service. So we have to be able to identify these cows as non-pregnant. I always say your veterinarian does not make you any money by telling you a cow is pregnant. They make you money by finding the open cows, and then you can do something with them. Pregnancy loss complicates this. And I think pregnancy loss is probably our big rate limiting step now. So I'll show a little bit of data. This is a graph early on with ObSync. What they did is they had preg checks at different times. If a cow is pregnant on day 28 with a heartbeat, fetus with a heartbeat, the loss from 28 to 42 was almost 11%. From 42 to 56, an additional 6%. And then after day 70, that loss kind of slows down. But the total loss was 1 in 4. 1 in 4 pregnant cows is losing a pregnancy. So that's starting at day 28. There's a lot of new information. This is some from Milo Wiltbank's lab. We can do pregnancy diagnoses as early as day 17 by looking at a certain gene. It's called an interferon stimulated gene. And I'll just show you this graph. So from 17 to 22 days in gestation, 12.8% loss. Here's the big one, 22 to 33, 24.6% loss. So before you even know a cow is pregnant, we see tremendous rates of loss. I mean, on day 17, Amber, 81% of the cows had a signal for pregnancy. So we think that this is probably the biggest rate limiting step right now is this pregnancy loss story. But it also messes around with pregnancy diagnosis. And I was going to put a bunch of slides in here on this. I think I've talked about this a lot in the industry. We want to preg check early, but not too early. Okay. Too early causes problems because we're going to identify cows that are pregnant that aren't going to stay pregnant. That's the problem. So a lot of people did a resync this way. So what I'm showing here is just a calendar. On Friday, they got a timed insemination. 25 days later, you can set up with GnRH. Day 32, you can do an ultrasound for non-pregnancy diagnosis, and then you finish off your ObSync protocol. And now you have a resync interval of 35 days. Very popular. Another alternative is to wait a week. So now we're doing what I call is the day 32 resync. You can set up with GnRH, do a preg check on day 39, finish the protocol in the open cows, and now we have a 42-day interval between timed insemination. So those, I'm just presenting those, Amber, as 2 kind of main strategies that I see people using out there. But early on, when I first came here and started thinking about what I wanted to try to impact, this is just showing you that at first service, 47% conception rate. That's because it was a double ObSync program. But then doing these resyncs, like I just showed you, fertility just dropped way back into the 30s. And a lot of people just said, well, what's going on? Why can't we get better fertility at these resync breedings? And a lot of people told me, well, the reason is that those cows are not as fertile. In other words, you get all the high fertility ones pregnant to first breeding, and then you're left with all the non-fertile ones. And I said, yeah, that could be it, but we're using a we're using a fertility program for first breeding that takes a lot of manipulation. Maybe the resyncs are just not optimized. And so what we did is we did a number of different experiments. This was like 15 years worth of stuff. So I'll show you kind of the highlights. So one of the things we did is we resync cows on an ObSync and we randomized them to get a progesterone insert or not. So that's a cedar device that contains progesterone. And we were interested in how that progesterone exposure might affect these cows. And the answer is very simple. If a cow does not have a corpus luteum and she's open, she'll have, and you put her on an off sync, she'll have low fertility, 23% versus 33%. If you put a progesterone insert into that cow, you return her to the fertility as if she had a corpus luteum. Okay, so um, it. Let me say this another way. It doesn't make any sense to put a cedar into a cow that has a corpus luteum. It's the no CL cows that benefit from that progesterone. Okay, so that's one part of the key. And then the other thing we did is we said, all right, well, if we add a second prostaglandin, like I showed you before in double ovsync, we can get an increase there as well. And so we came up with a resynchronization program that I'll show you now. So what we did is either on 25 or 32 days post insemination, we just set the cows up with GnRH. We gave them all GnRH, regardless of pregnancy status, because GnRH is cheap and it doesn't hurt the pregnancy. And then we delayed the pregnancy diagnosis of that prostaglandin. And again, the key to the resync is, do they have a CL or not? If they have a CL, we just finished them off. If they didn't have a CL, we restarted ObSync and we used the progesterone insert. We put a cedar into them. And this was very popular and was being used quite widely. What happened then is people started buying these activity monitors. And I'm showing a graph of return to estrus. It's a graph you can get out of a herd management software program. But if you give GnRH on day 25 and you ovulate a follicle, you form a corpus luteum, and you actually inhibit cows from coming into heat and you force them through the protocol. So again, Julio, my former student who's at Cornell now, did a nice little study here where what they did is they simply came in on day 32 after a breeding, they preg checked them. If they had a corpus luteum, they short synced them. So they started not at the first GnRH, they started at the prostaglandin, gave two prostaglandins 24 hours apart, then a GnRH treatment, and then it did a timed insemination. If they had no CL, they put her on a cedar sync. That's what we always do with the no CL cows. So he did this on day 32 and showed that, overall the program, the fertility to the short sync was not that great, but you gain a week on them. Okay. And so we decided, this is some recent data from my grad student, Megan, worked with a farm here in Wisconsin, and what this farm wanted, and that's another thing I'd tell you, Amber, when I go to a farm, I mean, tell me what you want and I'll put together the program. We were just over in the UK and there's things they can and can't do. And so we said, what can you do? We'll put a program together. So they're doing 100% timed AI to a double off sync program for first breeding. And they have heat detection systems. So they want to catch as many cows as possible coming back into estrus. And we said, great, what I would do then is I would delay the preg check till day 39. And what we did is we randomized cows to either get GnRH or not on day 32. And then on day 39, they got to the preg check, and then we could see what happened with them. And so I'll just run through this quickly. This graph is just showing by parity the return to estrus. And the key here, Amber, is that by day 32, cows have shown a heat if they're going to show a heat. So you kind of let that estrus happen. They can breed those cows to that estrus. And then we're going to come in and we're going to intervene with the resync. Okay. And so what happened was, if you look at the fertility to the estrus cows, it was right at about 50% in both groups. No difference, no detrimental effect of GnRH or anything like that. About half the cows pregnant to that return estrus. Then when we looked at just the few cows that got to the timed AI, no difference there as well. 42% conception rate versus 44% conception rate. So the 42 is if they got GnRH ahead. The 44 is if they didn't. So it doesn't seem to matter whether or not you give them GnRH up front. Okay. And then we just looked at when you combine the estrus and the time to AI, identical, 48% conception rates across the board, which isn't too bad for a second breeding. And so our recommendation would be in this kind of a scheme is that you can watch your cows come into heat. When you do the non-pregnancy diagnosis, if they don't have a CL, you do the lower protocol, the short sync. If they don't have a CL, did I say if they do have a CL, right? Is that what I mean? They do have a CL, you do the short sync. If they don't, we use that progesterone insert and do a cedar sync on those cows. And I think this is a good strategy in the era now that we have these heat detection systems. It's a nice way to pair that system with kind of this resync type of a program. And so I'm going to finish up with this graph. And what you can see, I've just shown a strategy that I think yields fairly high fertility, high 21-day preg rates. So use a fertility program for first insemination. And here's the reasons I would do that. You control your voluntary waiting period. If I'm doing that, I'm not going to have a 6-day voluntary waiting period. I'm going to have a 75 to 85-day voluntary waiting period. You get 100% of your cows submitted within a week of the end of the voluntary waiting period. We get the highest fertility we can get, about 10% higher than breeding those cows to estrus. And we've done a number of studies where we can pair this kind of a system with sexed beef semen and get better fertility with more expensive sex semen. So that's first service. And then you'll see about half your cows don't get pregnant. A lot of them will come back into estrus. And so you can breed those cows coming back into estrus. You can use a tail chalk program. You could use a heat detection system, which are very popular now. And you'll catch cows coming back into heat. Now, you'll never catch them all coming back into heat. Okay. And so what you have to do is a preg check. And so what I'm showing is coming in that scheme that I showed you before, come in on day 39 and just optimize the resync based on plus or minus corpus luteum. And by day 42, you got the majority of your cows re-inseminated. And that, Amber, is a strategy that I see, at least in our part of the world, our part of the United States, with high producing dairies in confinement-based systems, where our heat detection rates are probably not great because they're indoors all the time. And, we have ice on the ground, a big part of the year. And so this is a program that works really well, at least in our part of the world. So with that, Amber, I'm going to stop and I rolled through those slides pretty quick. So I think we have
You
a few
did
minutes.
wonderfully on time here.
Good.
I just have to say that last slide you showed, it's such a good combination of the technology that we have today, while also utilizing science to make sure that that technology is being utilized effectively and not just as a way of, or a means and way of, well, we've got this now, we have to use this, which
Sure.
doesn't always mean it's effective. We have questions that came in.
Oh, great.
So we have one here that I think I'm going to start with this one. It's a top question right now anyway. So it reads, with 50% of cows getting pregnant off of first AI, how do we increase that number? Is it more of a people and protocol issue, or is it outside factors and cow side issues?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And so this person has to appreciate that we've increased fertility at first service from the mid 30s to 50. Okay. So what I would say in response to that is a lot of the low hanging fruit has been picked. We kind of figured out some of the problems. We were able to improve from 35% conception rates to 50% conception rates. In my mind, I think one of the big rate limiting steps, and I said this in my talk, is this pregnancy loss issue. On day 17, we know that about 80% of cows, there's a pregnancy signal there. They have an embryo that is healthy enough to signal the maternal system that it's there. They just don't maintain those pregnancies. So I think in my mind, in order to get that first service conception rate up, we have to figure out what is causing these pregnancy losses, and we have to overcome that. And there's a lot of people that are working in that area now, Milo Wiltbank included, Richard Pursley's working in that area. All of us are very interested and recognize that that's probably our greatest rate limiting step right now, preventing these cows from having pregnancy loss. Yeah.
Well, that'll be interesting to see what comes of that because, like you said, you start with one place for research, and it's amazing where it brings you into today's day and age. But going off of that and kind of into the next question I have is when we're thinking about these systems that we have in place or these protocols that we have in place, if somebody out there is not seeing the numbers, conception or pregnancy rates that they're hoping or thinking they should be seeing,
Yep.
where is the first place they should look besides the protocol? If they are like, the
Yeah.
protocol is down pat.
This is great. And we do a whole exercise usually with veterinarians where we make them think, try to answer this question. And I'll start with the most obvious one. Number one is compliance to the program. And people hate it when I ask that question. It's an old problem, but you just have to make sure that the right cows are getting the right stuff on the right day. Okay. So that would be my step number one. We're much better at compliance now, but I don't think it's a non-issue. Number two, these things have, you have to have healthy cows. So ObSync, and I could have shown a nice study, ObSync does not fix lameness. It doesn't fix ketosis. It doesn't fix body condition score loss post-calving. It doesn't fix mastitis. And so a big issue that I run into in herds that aren't seeing results that I like 50% like I'm talking about is a lot of our herds here in Wisconsin are trying to use reclaimed manure solids for bedding. Now, I think the key to using those solids, and I can tell stories where people had beautiful sand-bedded freestalls, really good fertility. They rip that all out, put a digester in, and they start using these reclaimed solids, and they have a disaster on their hands because cows that have mastitis have much lower fertility due to increased pregnancy losses. And so if you're going to use dried manure solids, you have to dry them. And that's what people are finding. So they have the tumble dryers. There's lots of dairies that have those, but you have to get the dry matter in that down in order to use that successful bedding. So that's just another obvious one. Herds that have really good repro have control over mastitis. If you have high rates of mastitis, you're not going to have good fertility. Okay. And then the third thing I would say is this whole concept of the high fertility cycle. We know that cows that calve thinner do better during the transition. They have higher fertility, they have less pregnancy loss, and all these sorts of things. And a reflection of poor reproduction are late lactation cows that are getting fat, calving as fat cows, losing a lot of body condition score. And that has a profound effect on reduction in fertility. So we call that the high fertility cycle. I kind of alluded that to that there. So I would say, I mean, to summarize, there's the protocols and complying to the protocols, but cow health, transition cow management, all those things are super important when you're looking at fertility of these programs. And of course, genetics plays a role as well. So.
Well, I have to say for folks who are wondering what the high fertility cycle is, maybe you missed that episode or want to just go back and go farther in depth. We do have an episode with Dr. Fricky on that. After this one, you can just head over to the little search bar. You can search high fertility cycle. You can search Dr. Fricky's name. It should pop up within one of the first ones there. One of the other questions I have, especially as we're discussing voluntary waiting periods, and we're extending those on, especially within programs like Double ObSync, for those who might be struggling within those pregnancy conception rates, if it's one of those other problems, how does a longer voluntary waiting period impact not only, I think about like the high fertility cycle, like we're talking. It takes a little bit longer for some of those cows to get pregnant. Would you recommend that they push their voluntary period up a little bit more?
Yeah.
What are some thoughts on that?
I don't like the idea of trying to affect fertility with the voluntary waiting period. I just don't think, I think that's the wrong way to think about the question. What happened is when reproduction gets really good, you end up drying cows off. They give a lot of milk. And I think the question that really, the voluntary waiting period question comes to me now that way. I'm drying off cows giving a ton of milk. should I increase my voluntary waiting period? And there was really an interesting analysis that was done by Kevin Duvetter, Milanco, that he presented at the Western Dairy Management Conference. And he modeled milk lactation curves from different, I think, 11 different dairies. For the older cows, if you're 100% timed AI, it seems like that mid 70-day voluntary waiting period is about right. And I think economically as well, it's about right. If you increase it, you fight against the high fertility cycle because by increasing the voluntary waiting period, you are extending the lactation by that amount. And the question I always ask people, when you extend your voluntary waiting period by a week, you are buying a week of milk production at the end of lactation where it's the lowest, right? So do you want 7 more days of low milk production? Is that what you actually want? And so I think that 70-day voluntary waiting period is about right. People ask all the time about first lactation cows versus older cows. I've had people say, well, my first lactation cows, they're not big enough. They're still growing, they're still catching up. And my answer to that is, why don't you fix your heifer rearing problem? You don't want to fix your heifer rearing problem by changing your voluntary waiting period, right? And in fact, first lactation cows, although they're very persistent, if you get them into second lactation, they give a lot more milk because you're getting closer to that mature equivalent. And you also have selection bias and you select your better cows to go into second lactation. So the voluntary waiting period is a very big discussion. It's still a hot topic. Over in Europe, they're talking about extending lactations again. This seems to come around every 10 or 15 years. And the answer is no, we don't want to extend our voluntary waiting periods that way. We don't need a 50-day voluntary waiting period anymore, especially if you're 100% timed AI. If you're pre-sync op-sync with cherry picking first, I would probably have a 50 or 60-day voluntary waiting period at that first prostaglandin. So it depends on the program that you're running as well. So it's a little complicated. I should think about doing a voluntary waiting period talk at some point, but it's all modeling data based to answer that particular question.
Well, no, I think that's a great way to think about it is that it's a give and a take. No matter what you're doing, there's a give and a take. But it depends on which side of it you want to be on. And there's one side that has bigger pros and more cons. So, with all that being said, one more question here that we have from a listener, and it reads, we use double off sync, but still have issues in the summer with pregnancy rates. Assuming it's because of heat and temps, we have sprinklers and other heat mitigation. Is this just an issue? Is this just an issue we have to deal with, or is there something we can do to better help our cows stick?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm not sure where this person's from. Here in the upper Midwest, we do have some heat stress. It's generally constrained to a pretty short time of the year, I guess. But we do know that heat stress does affect conception rates. It basically is you cause problems with fertilization, number one, in heat stress cows. The fertilization rates are lower. And also early embryonic loss, probably before day 7 or so, before the embryo can protect itself from those elevated temperatures. So cooling cows is our very best strategy to deal with that. So the more you can cool those cows, and I've worked with cows in cross-ventilated barns, for example, they simply do not see the big dips with heat stress that you'll see in a naturally ventilated barn, just because they can have so much cooling that happens in those particular situations. So I think cooling cows is good. Another technology that can mitigate heat stress is embryo transfer. But embryo transfer brings with it a whole lot of other problems, and that is lower pregnancies per ET and higher rates of pregnancy loss. It's a technology that we're trying to figure out some of the problems with that particular technology too. But we can improve fertility with an embryo transfer type of program. But I'm not recommending that because semen is cheap, embryos are expensive, and so until we can figure out the problems with the IVP embryos, I think we're kind of stuck with just trying to cool your cows as best you can.
Well, Dr. Fricky, I think that is our last question for the day. So I just have to say thank you so much for your time here this afternoon. It's
You bet.
much appreciated, and I just enjoy getting to nerd out and writing all my notes down for things to think about. But with all that being said, appreciate your time, and I appreciate those who are also watching and listening and asking your questions as well. I know it's a busy time of year, so I'm glad we had some questions come through. And last but certainly not least, I do have to mention that if you're somebody who's thinking, gosh, what are some ways that I can get my cows to, get pregnant faster? I believe, if I recall, well, maybe not faster, but get my cows pregnant and stick. I believe Dr. Fricky alluded to it a little bit earlier too, that lameness is an issue that, definitely impacts you getting results here at the end. And we have a lameness program coming up here in June, taking place in New York on June 16th and Wisconsin on June 18th. So if you're interested in that and making sure your cows have sound feet to walk on, check those out. We are over at our website at pdpw.org to learn more and to get registered. But for now, thank you for your time here today and hope you have a great rest of your, end of May here. We'll see you here next Thursday, this Thursday, one of these Thursdays on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.